definition. This is an old instrumentation. I'm on the microphone for new decision. Indiscretion, asking why the lesson. Talk about the rapper with the bull resurrection. Hateration on the 24/7. Keep on rapping, watch out for abominations. Screaming in the background from destruction. Buildings getting missiled down, yo, disgusting. I like to talk about the Jesus Christ. They said I was weak, cause I talked about the price. Give a new lesson, instrumentation. This is on the microphone, miraculous sensation. Desensitized cause you rapping from the gods. While they higher and higher, they can't be seeing up the bras. Yo, you ain't making no
20 years later, 20 years later in the making. 20 years later, 20 years later, 20 years later in the making. 20 years later, 20 years later, 20 years later, no more faking.
So I'm rolling the dice, went to casino, gambling all my life away so he know. So I could be a superstar MC, so I could make all the money in the industry. Rigged up any way you feel me, 24/7 everybody peel me. This life ain't nothing but about the money. You're doing everything else around the money. You get the money, now you feel like you somebody, but then you got some money and you're nobody. Inside you feel empty and it's pointless. This is how the life it had to be, yo, you're conscious. You got money, now you feeling real good. They still got you bound up, slaved in the hood. You ain't got no freedom, this is how you live. You think you gangster and you harder than anybody is. One talk, you talk too much and then you gone. This how we gonna rapping on the microphone like Psalms. I can't believe I can't even sell for $1. They wanna take all my money, so I'm a bother. I ain't even be able to live on the streets. I ain't got no money and I looking like a freak. A homeless man living under the bridge. He didn't have no money and nobody really gives. Too many people at Saks Fifth Avenue. They didn't care about the homeless man bother you. Now you gonna understand, take responsibility. I'm rapping like a rapper, like with no agility. I slam dunk and then they understand the flow. The people really just wanna be entertained, yo.
20 years later, 20 years later, 20 years later in the making. 20 years later, 20 years later, 20 years later in